Right. Oh, everybody settle down, I hope. Today I'll be talking about Darwinism and evolution. Three different things there. Darwin started what became known as Darwinism. He didn't start evolution. Evolution was there before Darwin. And the evolution that we deal with today is different from what Darwin brought about, because there were a few missing gaps there that he wasn't able to explain. Now, we could just maybe give some idea about what sort of questions, what sort of mysteries were puzzling people, naturalists at that time, things such as the fossils. Now, quite a number of different sort of fossils that were appearing. Some people just called them jokes of nature. Some gave some religious connotation there, suggesting that these might actually be false signs from Satan to lure us from our faith. Or sometimes some others went as far as saying it's God's test of our faith. And the semi-religious view is that there were some mythical dragons or serpents there that eventually were killed or were dead, and their remains is what we see. And then also religious connotation there, suggesting that there were monsters turned into stone by supernatural powers, maybe killed by saints and so on. And there were the general scientific view, if we can call it that, that they were just creatures that went extinct for some reason or another. Now, also, other things that were puzzling naturalists at that time was why there was so much variation and so much diversity. Why so many different species that, obviously at that time in the 19th century, people in Europe were becoming aware of more and more and more species. They're exploring the world and seeing different sorts of species in different continents. And so the question was why there were so many different species in different continents serving the same purpose or doing the same job. And why was so much variation within the same kind? Why wasn't every species just one sort that will function properly and everybody or every organism will look the same? Now, the awareness of the diversity of living things that people became aware of brought many mysteries, and actually a question that was puzzling people such as Darwin and like Darwin: are species fixed or they change over time? Are the species the way we see them at the time of creation, or did they change over some period of time, and how long ago was this? And obviously one of the evidences that they were using is the fact that there were so many different forms that were found in the fossils. And so some species look different a million years ago, but obviously at that time the million year was something that could only be imagined. Nobody suggested that the Earth was that old. And then comes Charles Darwin at the beginning of the 19th century. And being the son of a doctor, his father also wanted him to be a physician. And so he joined the medical school. He wasn't very happy there. He wasn't at home. And so he left. And then he transferred to Cambridge to study theology, which is ironic for someone who eventually becomes, to many people, the enemy of the church, that he was actually planning to become a minister in the Church of England. Now, all in all, he was generally giving the impression that he was a mediocre student, not really very clever and not really very serious. And his father one day wrote to him, because he was so disappointed, said, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and your family." Now, in 1831, he got this chance to join this voyage, Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. He joined the ship as the ship's naturalist, which was a customary thing to have on every ship. A naturalist would usually collect specimens. He would actually give insight into the geology and to collect geological data and so on. And so he had the chance of moving from England all the way to the Amazonian forest in Brazil And there he was able to see the enormous diversity that these forests were showing. He collected birds, insects, spiders, and the like. He was actually, he had a chance to meet some local Indians at the tip of South America where conditions were very cold, and he was really impressed with their ability to survive despite the very cold, hostile environment. Now, he witnessed an earthquake while he was in Chile. Chile, we know, we hear it all the time in the news, having earthquakes. It's a place where earthquakes occur, and he had the chance to be in one of those. And he witnessed the earth rising from like 2 meters, the level of the land. And that left an impression. How could some small earthquake would raise 2 meters? And that actually sent him thinking. Now, he spent some time in those islands in the archipelago of Galapagos. And there he had a notable experience, because on that island he was able to see a variety of organisms that did not exist anywhere else except on those islands. Very unique islands, very unique organisms. And these were volcanic islands uninhabited by man, but they were inhabited by a variety of animals, including mammals and birds, crabs, and so on. And some of them were quite unique to a lot of them were actually quite unique to the archipelago. And he was able to see even different forms in the different islands in the archipelago. Now, it's quoted that he said in his narration of the trip that he felt brought within reach of that great fact, that mystery of mysteries. That mystery of mysteries he was talking about was actually the question of creation, not creation of organisms, the creation of new species. Because how could new species occur? And he felt that there were some really fabulous examples that he was able to see in the islands. Now, after he came back to England, he spent time writing all sorts of books. Actually, there's no doubt that the voyage changed his life. If it didn't actually get him eventually to talk about evolution, but he had plenty of things to work on. All these specimens he collected from here and there. And actually the collection of all these specimens that also gave him insights more and more into other questions, more grand questions, such as where did you all come from, or all these species. Now, for 20 years, he didn't actually bother much about writing anything on the question of evolution, because he was afraid to be eaten alive by other naturalists and by the people, because it was such a controversial subject. But in 1858, he had no choice but to really tell his ideas. His friends knew that he was talking about an idea related to the change of organisms, didn't call it evolution. But eventually, one other naturalist in the Far East sent him a manuscript he wanted to publish, and it contained some ideas of the sort that Darwin was thinking about, something to do with the mechanism of evolution. And so his friends advised him that he should really eventually dare and publish. And so in 1858, they presented they had a joint presentation, 2 papers by Wallace and Darwin, about the idea of evolution. But obviously, the idea of evolution was there before, but what they were suggesting was a mechanism. And that mechanism became known as natural selection. Now, at that time, there wasn't much response, and so the year after, he published his major work there on the subject, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, he was worried that the book would not sell, but in fact, it was sold in one day. It was a bestseller, and he had eventually to print more and more. And in that book, there was no mention of the word evolution there. He actually preferred the term descent with modification, because that's what he was actually talking about, that organisms descend from ancestor to descendants with some modifications along the way. Eventually, in his 6th edition, he mentioned the word evolution. He actually mentioned the verb evolve in the last paragraph in the book, but not the word evolution, except until the 6th edition. Now, to give an idea about what evolution is and what Darwin suggested, There are four principal postulates, and we'll see which ones were Darwin's and which ones were actually somebody else's. So the first aspect there is the non-constancy of species. Species change over time. And there is variation within species, and there's change that occurs over time. The process is very slow, very gradual, and it might not be noticed from generation to generation, except after many generations. And also the notion of branching, where this will lead to such diversity. Organisms branch into all sorts of other organisms, and then there'll be so many different kinds of organisms there. Now, the first three were actually things that people dealt with before, people thinking about these ideas before, but nobody was able to really produce a mechanism. So the fourth one, the mechanism of evolution by natural selection, was actually Darwin's idea. The change, the descent modification actually occurred through natural selection. So let's look at each one of these postulates. First, the non-constancy of species, and this is something that is an old idea. It's not that it actually lasted very long or that people carried it forward. Greek philosopher and Roman philosopher, Lucretius, were actually toying with these ideas before, that all living things were related, and they had changed over time. And obviously, without much evidence to support, it remained just a philosophical idea that... Now, before Darwin, in the 19th century, also Lamarck brought some idea of evolution, which he called the transmutation of species. Now, Lamarck got a few things right, and he got a few things wrong, and we'll talk about this later. But the idea of change was something that was there before Darwin. Now, the idea of change, gradually, very slowly, the slow change over time, was something that wouldn't have been easily accepted, or at least until Buffon and Cuvier ideas actually vanished. And these were the ideas of catastrophism. Now, in an effort to try to explain what these fossils are and how things change and so on, they suggested that the Earth experienced catastrophes every now and then such huge major catastrophes eventually would lead to the extinction of all the species, and then a new page starts, and then you have new species appearing, and so on. So this is at least some of the ideas that later, religious answers to this was that creation actually occurred more than once. But catastrophism, even with the idea that things will change suddenly, disappearance of species occurs suddenly, and then you have a new creation, even with that, they struggle hard not to extend the Earth of the age of the Earth to 70,000 years. But actually, even that one required that the Earth should have been very old. Now, a creationist suggestion was that there were quite a number of creations, because actually they were referring to so many changes that occur in the fossil record. So 50 to some 100 successive divine creations. Now, this was not what Darwin was suggesting, because actually Darwin relied on some other ideas from geology, and that's the idea of uniformitarianism. Now, the uniformitarian concept suggests that if you want to understand what happened so long ago, you don't have to go that long ago in a time machine and find out what happened. Just look at what's happening today. That the same forces that are at play now, they were the same forces at play at that time. Even catastrophic ones occur in those days, like volcanoes erupt. Today they erupt. A million years ago they erupt, whatever. So the same forces. Now, just to give you an idea what that actually means and what are the implications. For example, to take some structure such as a huge place such as the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta did not just form in a catastrophic event. It actually formed very slowly, sedimenting year after year, year after year. We can actually witness these sort of sedimentations occurring here in this country. Every time we get the beginning of the winter, then the place, Beirut will become sedimented until they clean it up. Even a few millimeters of sediment eventually would compile over 1,000 years. That will make 1,000 millimeters. 1 million years, that will make 1 million millimeters. And so it might have started as some small processes like flooding, and sedimentation, and then sedimentation over sedimentation, year after year after year, and then you get sometimes huge places created in this manner. So the idea that something that we can see, something very simple like the Jaita structures there. These actually form like 1 meter. It's suggested that 1 meter would take about 8,000 years. So these structures were not there from the beginning. They are actually created by very small processes, a drop of water after drop of water. And it leaves something behind and leaves something below. And so these structures above and below, they extend and extend very slowly and very gradually. Now, if you want to explain a process that actually happens so gradually and so slowly, that means you have to have a big time frame. And that required that the Earth should actually be very old. Now, the first one to actually incorporate the idea of uniformitarianism was Lamarck. Lamarck, he actually put this idea into biology because it was actually an idea that geologists were adopted. And so this was the first attempt to explain biological evolution by adopting the idea of transmutation of species by gradual processes through the idea of uniformitarianism. In other words, if there are differences between one species and the other, it didn't just occur over 1 year, 100 years, 1,000 years. You have to actually think of something like million year, 100,000 years, something like this, before species actually show significant differences from their ancestors. The idea of branching was also something that Darwin found inevitable to adopt, because here the idea that organisms actually change in different conditions, different environmental conditions, that means that different species might actually change in different ways. And so that meant that you had a variety of species that were evolving in different parts of the world because of the different effects that you find in different parts of the world. Before Darwin and others, the idea of the scale of nature that was adopted at that time was that we could classify organisms in this hierarchy, that you have the sort of inferior, primitive, the lower, primitive is something that in evolution, lower organisms, you go from inanimate matter to some that you call them lower plants, and then there are also lower animals and so on. Eventually, higher animals, eventually leading to humans. Now, in the Christian church adopted, the Christian philosophy would take this further and say, yeah, humans are at the top, but above humans there are also the supernatural, more perfect creatures like angels, and then you have the archangels, and eventually at the top of this hierarchy was God. Now, this was actually, an idea that it actually dealt away with the idea of perfectionism, because nowadays we don't think of any organism as being perfect. Every organism has traces of all sorts of problems. So the idea of branching was that the organisms cannot be classified on being lower or higher. All organisms that exist today are in a way at the same level, because they have all undergone evolution to such an extent that they're able to exist very well in their own environment and given their own morphology. Now, one important idea that's something I quote from Darwin, saying that the only cause of similarity, if we find organisms that are similar, why are they similar? Because at that time, there was Linnaeus who was classifying, and other people were classifying organisms. Usually, they put similar organisms in one group, and then each similar group put them together, and so on. Now, on what basis they were putting them as being similar, putting them in the same genus or the same family or whatever, was based on similarity. Now, Darwin was suggesting that the only cause of similarity that you can really think about for these individuals is actually relationship. Like, because they're related, they are similar. It's not just simply because they are just similar. They are related, they descend from common ancestors, and that's why they are related, and that's why they are similar. And it's like, for example, if you look at humans, I mean, the only reason why several people look similar is because they descend from some ancestor. That's why you get different families looking more or less very similar, other families look different, and so on. So relationship, that means descent from ancestors, is the main reason why organisms are similar. And these are some of the scribblings that Darwin had trying to put together some idea about some family trees for some organisms. Now, we come to the idea that Darwin and Wallace brought about. We always emphasize it's not just Darwin and Wallace, but Darwin took it much further than Wallace by producing so much evidence. Now, Darwin's idea of natural selection was influenced by non-naturalists, like, for example, the economist Thomas Malthus. He suggested that the populations increase, human populations, you're talking about human populations. As the populations increase, the resources become scarcer. And that happens, there'll be shortages, there'll be all sorts of problems that come from this, including maybe famine, disease, war, etc. The idea of Malthus could be explained graphically like this. The population increases geometrically in this way, and the resources increase linearly. And so in that way, there's some point where the population becomes enormous relative to the resources, and so we have a point of conflict that occurs at some point. Now, the point of crisis there means that there aren't enough resources for the whole population, and then various sort of problems might actually occur. So Darwin suggested that if this is the way it happens in humans, then it might also happen in other organisms. We can actually think about the same mechanism happening in other organisms. Another thing that Darwin was able to see, and humans have been practicing for thousands of years, and that's actually artificial selection. You can think about dogs, for example. The first dog was adopted by some humans, and it's not known how long ago, but it is thousands of years ago. Maybe some wolf-like animal that eventually became domesticated because it's more likely to live with humans, it's less aggressive, etc. Now, from this sort of wolf-like dog, we have today a huge number of different breeds. Now, these are some of them that sometimes you might not even classify them as being dogs because they look so different from the archetypal dog that we think of having descended from wolves. Now, Darwin also was interested in pigeons, actually, but chicken breeds were things that people were actually doing, not sometimes for utilitarian basis, sometimes just for prestige, that I have a different breed. And so there were all sorts of different breeds of chicken that we can see. All of these were selected artificially. That means artificial selection would mean that people would choose amongst all the variety of individuals there, the one that is most convenient, most suitable. Like wheat, for example, we would select the wheat that doesn't grow long, tall, and then it produces more seed. And so we breed this one, we breed amongst the next generation also the best one, and so on. And that artificial selection could actually be practiced. I mean, it has probably been practiced for a very, very long time. And then in Europe, it was practiced extensively, and it applied to things like pigeons, different sort of plants, different sort of fruits, and so on. We know today that we have such a variety of things that are just selected artificially. And then if artificial selection could lead to changes within some population in this way, then maybe natural selection would lead to something similar. Now, the difference between Darwinian ideas and Lamarckian ideas appears here, where Lamarck suggested that evolution was actually a goal-oriented process. That means it's ultimately going to lead to perfection. Or there's some process that will lead to perfection anyway, like some sort of determinism. What Lamarck suggested, that species do not actually go extinct, but they become different species, which is true to some extent, but yes, some species go extinct, but some species actually go and become different species. And then the disastrous idea there that many people remember Lamarck with this idea that organs actually develop by use and disuse. They actually evolve also. So inheritance, which wasn't clear for many people at that time, but Lamarck suggested that if you have some characteristic, it will actually develop, and your ancestors, your descendants will actually inherit acquired characteristics. It's something like if you go and spend the whole month tanning, then your children should appear dark or black or whatever, which is obviously something that wouldn't take too much intelligence to realize that it didn't work. So for Lamarck, the idea of a giraffe evolving long necks was that each generation, if it was adaptive to use branches on a tree, and then the ones that have the taller necks will benefit more than the others that do not, then for each generation, all the giraffes would stretch their neck, and so eventually their children would inherit this stretched neck. Now, remember, Lamarck was also talking about something. They didn't have to stretch that much. Actually, a small change in the neck size would be inherited by the next offspring. But over many generations, then eventually this would translate into a longer neck. Now, natural selection, to take the idea of the giraffe's evolution, works differently. Like for Darwin, in any population, you have variation. Among the giraffes, you might have giraffes of various neck sizes. Some giraffes might have a slightly longer neck than the others. And so they will do better, and they will breed more, and so there'll be more of them in the next generation. Now, the problem with Darwin is that he didn't know where the variation, because people quizzed him on this variation, and he wasn't able to give any satisfactory answer. But he did know about mutation. Mutation is one sort of change and variation, and it didn't become known until the 20th century. So this was, as we know today, is the source of variation. But for Darwin, there was this variation, and then in the next generation, you might actually have slightly more giraffes of that characteristic. And then if these continue to do well, then they will, in the next generations, one after another, there'll be eventually the population will be replaced by giraffes of longer neck. The longer necked giraffes will do better and they have more offspring. The shorter necked giraffes will not do very well and they will eventually go extinct. They will have fewer offspring and then eventually they will disappear. So this is the idea of natural selection. Now, after the origin of species, a huge controversy was actually sort of dominating the scene in 19th century England at that time. But Darwin became a recluse. He stayed at home. His health was failing him, and he spent a lot of big part of his life suffering. But other people actually came out and they were speaking on his behalf. One of them was Thomas Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog. Now, Huxley regretted the fact that the idea of natural selection is so simple. How come I didn't think of it? How stupid it was that he didn't think of it. Actually, a number of other people thought the same thing. But they actually became infatuated with this idea, and so they became the defendants of this idea, of the idea of evolution. Now, Darwin at the time, before this, he didn't actually publish much on human evolution, but Huxley was more bold to publish things about the relationship between humans and primates, other species. And he actually coined some words that became known since then, like Darwinism and agnostic. Now, the word agnostic is something that people were not, they didn't want to say about themselves that they're atheists. And so atheism actually would be affirmative about God not existing. But agnosticism says, I don't know. That's what it means. It's not a question that we try to tackle with. Agnosticism is milder than atheism. There's no affirmation that there is no God, but we cannot say, or it's not a question that we can answer. Now, since that, Darwin published a number of books, including some on evolution, like The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, and The Expression of Emotion, and as comparison between man and other animals. Now, the main gap in Darwinian theory of evolution was actually the lack of knowledge about inheritance. Nobody was able to answer any good question there about how organisms inherit characteristics from their ancestors. But it took until the next century when the work of the monk Gregor Mendel actually became published. It was published then, but it was rediscovered. It was put in a new perspective. And so the idea of Mendelian genetics was there. And then, since then, the development of genetics of all sorts, like population genetics, molecular genetics, and so on, all of these actually constituted the single most important contribution to evolutionary thought. Now, we give a course in evolution in the biology department. A prerequisite is genetics, because if you're not well informed about genetics, some aspects of evolution couldn't be understood. So, based on this, in the 30s and 40s, there are the new synthesis of evolutionary theory based on this knowledge, new knowledge of genetics. And this is what's known as New Darwinism, or known sometimes as the synthetic theory of evolution. Now, what a theory is supposed to do is to explain some phenomena. So what does evolutionary theory explain? It explains fossils. Fossils that show that species change over time, that species might not actually be able to survive and they go extinct. The progression there, that shows that the more recent fossils look more similar to today's organisms. The deeper fossils, that the less recent, the old fossils, would look different from today's organisms. So there was some story there that the fossils will tell us. Obviously, it couldn't tell us the whole story because there were some gaps. And one would not be surprised, considering that you wouldn't have all organisms fossilized in any particular age. So some fossils get fossilized, some fossils do not. Some organisms get fossilized, some do not get fossilized. Now, people were able to tell different types of fossils, different sort of strata by the fossils there are there. And to tell how long ago this happened, they couldn't. It actually took also until this generation, where, in the 20th century, when people start putting ages such as millions of years, 100 millions of years, and so on. Now, fossils in some situations could be more complete, and so they could tell us a whole story, like the story of the evolution of the horse. We have all the fossils. The horse started as being a very small mammal, and then it became bigger and bigger as time passed over many geological ages. If you want sometimes to look at the relationship between some organisms, it might not look plausible. Like, for example, taking these two snails, two mollusks. If you look at the first one and the other one, they look different, and you might think that, well, there is nothing that you cannot actually put a relationship there. But if you look at all the intermediate stages, then it makes sense. And actually, to make sense, the gradual change there, to make sense, any story of evolution usually has to produce all sorts of intermediate stages there. Now, it explained systematics and biogeography. Classification of organisms was done on the basis of similarity. Now, it's not enough nowadays. Nowadays, the DNA is used to classify. But geographically, you have interesting situations there where related organisms happen to be neighbors. They are in the same geographic region, which indicates that there are some ancestors there. Now, you don't get related species between one continent and the other. The species in South America are different from the species in Africa. They're both tropical forests, but different species there. Now, whichever group of species organisms we look at, we find that the ones that tend to be most related are the ones that tend to be nearby. And so you could think of a story where one species descends into other species, and they remain in the same area. And then they would radiate from there. Now, the relationship that you might find between organisms in terms of their structures, what we call homologous structures. Like, for example, if you see the human hand, there are various bone structures there that you will see quite similar things in other distant organisms, such as birds and frogs and bats and so on. They have the same basic structure there. They might be different dimensions, different sizes, and different, but they're in the same location, more or less. Vestigial structures, one would see the ancestry of some organisms, like the whale is a mammal, and the mammals were land animals. And then at some point, on more than one occasion, mammals actually went into the sea, and they evolved to become marine animals, like the whale and dolphins and so on. Now, if you look in the structure of the bone structure of the whale, we can see some vestigial structure there. Still some bones that used to be legs, hind legs. You find the same thing in some other animals, such as snakes. We can see in some snakes there are some vestigial legs there. You find, for example, this is a lizard from Lebanon. It's thought of as being a snake. It's not actually a snake. If you look closely, you'll find that it still has some very vestigial legs there, because it's actually a lizard in all sorts of ways. Now, in humans, there are a number of vestigial structures that might actually be interesting, like the muscles that move the ear. We don't need anymore, but they're still there. They don't function. You don't see anybody turning his ear like other mammals from side to side. For example, body hair. Body hair, thermally, it doesn't have any purpose anymore. You don't have any function for the hair, but it's still there. Not only this, when we actually feel scared or when we feel cold, the hair erects like in other, like if you see the cats on campus, when they're nervous, they erect their hair. Now, our body still erects the hair despite the fact that it doesn't actually serve much purpose. We have the appendix that only produces trouble, and so it takes us to the hospital for being removed. The canine, the third molar teeth, which is what you call the wisdom teeth, also many of us experience problems because our jaw has become too small to take another tooth, and so when it actually emerges in the wrong angle, it emerges in a very tight place, and so on. One particular one, Darwin's tubercle there, Darwin's point. Some of you might actually see it. You can feel it there. Now, some of you might not feel it there because well, there's some gene that's involved in this, but if you don't feel it, doesn't mean that you're not descended from an ape. Now, vertebrate embryos, you look at the embryo in its earlier stages, you find that most embryos tend to be very similar. And then it's only as they develop, then they develop into adults of different sort. And there's no doubt that all organisms share things that, there's no other alternative. We have nucleotides, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, DNA, RNA, all of them are constituted in the same way. They have the same sort of constituents. In genetic engineering, you might actually use one DNA from one organism, put it in another organism, a different species even. You can put even bacteria, and then it still function because the mechanism involved is the same, so we have the same mechanism. Adaptations that we see in various sort of organisms indicate how they actually eventually become adapted to certain conditions. Now, we can see the different beak shapes in birds that are adapted for different sort of feeding habits. We have in mammals, for example, the variety of lifestyles that require certain adaptations. There are ones that live in the desert, there's ones that actually fly like the bats, and there you have also the ones that went into the sea, like the walrus and the whale and the porpoises and so on. And so one of the problems that people actually were not happy with is that how could we believe in something that we don't see happening? And that's actually evolutionary change. How could we believe that species emerge from other species? Obviously, you will not be able to see this because this will take millions of years, maybe less, but it would take a long time, not in our lifetime, not even in human history. But we can see evolutionary changes happening. Like, we are aware of bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics because with the use of antibiotics, the only bacteria that survive are the ones that have resistance to antibiotics. So they become the long-necked giraffes, if you like, and so they survive better than others. The same thing happens in insects where the application of pesticides also will produce insects that are resistant to pesticides. And tolerance to pollutants by a variety of organisms, including plants, for example, they become, even within a short, a few decades, you can actually see some transformation there. The other problem that people have with idea of evolution is how could something like so well adapted, or wouldn't say the word perfect, how could it come about just simply by chance? How could something that seems so well designed could appear without a designer? Now, evolution actually brings about this idea exactly, that things could happen without a designer. That physical forces would actually shape a number of things, including living things, over time because of simple physical processes that eventually will lead to changes that occur over time. Now, the notion of nature as a system of matter in motion governed by natural laws. And you could see this happening, and you can actually see the history of life. Now, there are things that we have in our human history that doesn't need a designer or never needed a designer. Languages. There's no evidence that any language was made by a designer. There were grammars put to language that exist, but there are so many languages on Earth that you can actually relate them in the same way that you can relate species. And also, species are not perfect, and also languages are not perfect. You can actually see the same imperfections in languages in the same way that species have these imperfections. There are so many languages, and notice also that related languages are those of people that live next door, like in the neighboring regions. They have similar languages, except in exceptional circumstances. So one would expect that with all these bold statements there, hostility to Darwin would actually become very severe, very fierce at various points, especially when it comes to where you accept the worm descended, into eventually became an insect. The insect became something, but to accept that humans actually were something and then they became something else. They were descended from a monkey, which is not true. I mean, strictly speaking, but the human evolution was something that is very hard for people to accept because we're supposed to be special. I mean, we have a soul. And then you cannot have humans like other animals. Now, human evolution at the time of Darwin, only a few things were known about. Actually, the only non-Homo sapiens, because that's the name of our human species, the non-Homo sapien, the only one that was known at that time was Homo neanderthalensis, which is actually a European form. That was the only known human fossil at that time. But since then, we have an enormous number of species. Even Darwin at that time suggested that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history that he couldn't do actually because he didn't have enough information. Now we have thousands of human fossils. We have tens of human species that existed together at some point. And they date back. I mean, we always get these twists in the story where, for example, more than a decade ago, it was suggested that the origin of human species was some like 7 million years ago. Now, the latest twist in this finding was the latest one, I think, was last year, I think, and that was the Homo naledi, which actually also introduced another twist in the story of human evolution, and you might expect this to happen next year and the year after. There are always some new additions to the story of human evolution. Now, behavior evolves in the same way that other morphologies evolve. Like behavior has a genetic basis, and it's actually something that should be taken with caution because not all behavior is inherited. But there's a big part of behavior that's inherited. We know, for example, if you examine different species of bees, we know how bees behave. Usually there are relationships there between these different species that indicate a relationship that come from DNA studies. So the ones that are closer in terms of DNA, they seem to show similar behavioral aspects. We have in humans inherited a number of things from other mammals, including primates. For example, something like as simple as a smile that we are used to, we know it's what part of human behavior. It's something that really would generate a response from the other person just by smiling. Now, if a chimpanzee meets another chimpanzee and it doesn't want to be aggressive, it actually bares its teeth like this. It eventually would evolve to become a smile. But you could see a lot of smiling monkeys there, maybe. This black and white one was an illustration from Darwin's book on human and animal behavior. This was the gesture given by the baboon there by scratching its back. As you scratch its back, it will bare its teeth, showing some delight there in being scratched in this way or groomed. Now, the one aspect of human behavior that worried people that it couldn't really be something other than divine, and that's really being humane or ethical behavior. Now, the way that human behavior shows similarities, for example, in the way that we make our mate choices. There are a number of things that show similarities with other animals, even with some insects. Social behavior, also being together, is something that you don't find in many animals, but there are many animals that have social behavior, and there are some common aspects there between our social behavior and our animals' social behavior. We have also definitely some unique behavioral characteristics that are unique to humans. It was thought that maybe at some point there was some mutation that occurred that allowed Homo sapiens to disperse in different parts of the world. And this tends to be together with people that are not related to you, like just get somebody, okay, let's go to that place, and then let's go to that place. It was a development of social behavior that allowed humans to explore different parts of the world, reaching as far as Australia, for example, and the Americas as well. The scientific basis of ethics is not something that we think of as being taught to us by religion or by philosophers or whatever. The idea of ethics has a biological basis, and there was some misconception of this by some people like Spencer in the end of the 19th century, where he thought that he could actually speed up evolution and direct evolution, and by making what became known as social Darwinism, which is actually the wrong label there. This is not in line with evolution, Darwinian evolution or modern evolution. And the idea of ethics is something that we might see in humans, and so we can reason it, we can rationalize it, we can usually put some religious connotation to this, but actually being together, looking after each other is a biological need. And it's difficult to survive on your own. And we can see this in a number of different species. The most related one, like the chimpanzees, we also have lions that live together. We have more primitive organisms like ants and bees that live in social groups that far exceed our social group. And we know how each particular individual amongst the bees might sacrifice itself for the sake of the group. This is something that goes beyond what humans are capable of doing. So ethics is something that is a biological need. It's not something that necessarily is something that has to come from 10th commandments or something like this. Now, the impact of evolutionary theory, first, that evolution became the organizing principle of geology. Some people suggest that nothing could make sense in biology except in the light of evolution. The modern Darwinian zeitgeist, which actually some people suggest that it had more influence on humans' worldview than any other idea, even the theories in physics and so on. It refuted teleology and determinism. Nothing is determined. Chance has an important thing, and so the final cause or teleological forces, that means it's bound to reach a particular place, like humans are supposed to have evolved eventually in Earth. They might not have evolved in the first place. And so universality of chance and randomness is something that we are aware of in other sciences, such as in physics. And typology is also demolished by evolution, and so we have different concepts of species. Now, rejecting supernatural causation, obviously that will have provoked a lot of hostility. It was a direct challenge to Christian philosophy, and it's also a challenge to other religions as well. And so there's this easy and the uneasy relationship there between Darwinism and other religious establishment. Now, in the United States, for example, they started coming out with theories to challenge the theory of evolution. Now, you might actually come with some like creationist science, another one is intelligent design. Evolution has been blamed for all sorts of ills, all sorts of evils. Evolution is the root and the stem of this. Now, you might actually be able to demolish a number of things. You might actually be able to criticize a lot of things. But evolutionary theory is a model that has no other model that could explain the evolution of living things. Living things today, we understand them from the evolution perspective, and there's no other theory there that could explain life on Earth better than the theory of evolution that we know today. Now, here in the AUB, there was a conflict that occurred in 1882 at the commencement exercises. Somebody quoted Darwin, or actually praised Darwin as an example of a scientist, and George Post wasn't happy with this, because remember, this establishment was a missionary. And so there was a conflict, and students were actually, there were faculty resignations, and well, obviously we've come over this. I've been teaching evolution for the last 25 years, and nobody's having any problems with this. Anyway, so we have a new view of humanity that would put man at the center, despite the fact that it's just an animal, like some people might say, but it's still, humans are still special. Now, eventually, all this hostility, when Darwin died, he was actually buried in the Westminster Abbey. So, in a way, the Church of England adopted Darwin, and he was buried there along with the great men of England at that time. And so he died as an agnostic, despite what some people might actually suggest. Now, if you ask humans what they think about evolution from monkeys, well, not many people are happy, but monkeys don't seem to be happy about the idea either. Thank you very much.